Trev, what's happening, man? Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Adam. I appreciate it.
Man, I've been looking forward to this one for a while, even though we had to reschedule a few times, just because you're one of the homies from the original days. You're the OG, so this is just going to be fun to catch up and at the same time learn about some cool projects you guys are doing out in New York City with the rest of the Resilient crew.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate that.
Let's just set the stage real quick. Give people a little bit of insight as to how you got to where you are, being a co-founder of Resilient Performance in New York City, what Resilient's about, and then just kind of a little bit of your origin story, man. I think people love to hear that, how people got to where they are.
Yeah, so like a lot of people kind of in the industry, grew up playing sports and all that. I wanted to be a strength coach when I was young. I played football through college. I love training. I love lifting weights. I think I was almost more passionate about that than I was like the sport itself. And I was always interested in how people move and how to improve the way people move and all that fun stuff. So wanted to be a strength coach. My parents encouraged me to go to physical therapy school just because it might give me a little bit more of like a diverse skill set. So I really never thought twice about it. Like from my freshman year of high school, probably, I was just like, I'm going to go to physical therapy school. Like got to college, knew I was going to go to physical therapy school. And like I said, for better or for worse, I never thought twice about it. Went to PT school after undergrad, and Greg Spatz and I were roommates, which was fortuitous and kind of worked out for us. And then met Doug Kachijan, who our other business partner, who's a year ahead of us in PT school. And all of us just kind of had similar backgrounds of playing college sports, working as strength coaches, really liked the way strength and conditioning principles could kind of be blended with physical therapy and how they really did fit together versus like, I really think at that time they were looked at really separate worlds that like didn't have much overlap. And we kind of knew, like a lot of people are in our industry nowadays, knew that two could be blended together really well. So when we graduated PT school, we started Resilient Performance Physical Therapy. We had our first practice in Manhattan in 2015, opened up our practice here in Jersey in 2017, currently have a practice in Manhattan, a practice in Rye, New York. We have a spot here in Chatham, New Jersey, a spot in Wharton, New Jersey, where Greg is out of a pitching facility. And then we're going to have another location in Boonton, New Jersey soon with a friend of mine who's a wrestling coach. So it's been fun, growing clinically, like as an individual physical therapist, just developing my own skill set, and then also growing the business and opening new locations, having students, all that fun stuff.
Now, of the three of you, which one of y'all had the experience working for the team sports or consulting for the team sports, or was it all of you?
So like Greg had worked for the Diamondbacks, but so I was the only one that went directly from undergrad to PT school. Greg took 2 years off, which is why we ended up in the same class together in PT school. He worked for the Diamondbacks as a strength coach for a couple of years. Doug was in the military for a while and then interned at Cressy's and then got his master's in like exercise phys, I think, from Columbia before he started PT school. So like Greg was the only one that had really worked in like the pro sports kind of environment, but just through people we knew and things like that, we kind of just built relationships with, different people over the years. Like same thing with you. It's like we met at a course. The number of people we've met at courses and built relationships with, has just been huge. And then all of us were, did a clinical with Alan Groover in Arizona, who you were with, who was just a huge mentor of ours, and definitely like helped shape our thought process clinically and just kind of how we operate a ton. So we've just been really fortunate to have good mentors throughout our time together.
Yeah, because you guys are definitely looked upon it in my eyes, and maybe there's a personal bias there, but definitely yourself. There's probably another clinic like Josh Funk and his business over in the Baltimore area. Like y'all are kind of the two people that the two groups that I always look for as far as, okay, who you guys grooming for clinicians, who can we hire in pro sports, right? Like I think just because, like you said, the relationships and indirectly the experiences y'all have had with the pro sports setting, because you guys get a lot of clientele that are in the sports, whether the high school, college, or the pro setting. So I think you guys, it's just really cool to see what you guys have built there. But at the same time, like you guys have a great philosophy about how you guys go about things.
I really appreciate that. And the comparison with Funk's group is interesting because we've shared tons and tons and tons of clinical students with R2P over the years. And when we first started out, there was like more people kind of in the private practice world that I think we would recommend for clinicals and stuff. And then a lot of them have gotten poached by pro sports and, gone up. And then, so it's really like R2P is always a spot that we always recommend that our students go to. So, I mean, we've probably had at least 10 students that have had a clinical with us and a clinical with R2P. And that's been a really good relationship. And it's different settings in terms of what their, kind of model is compared to ours, but the philosophy, I really would say, is probably not all that different in terms of like what we're chasing. It's just the in-network versus the out-of-network model is just a different model.
Yeah, they're different. They're different, but both providing good things. But like one thing
sure.
I want to double click on, just like a personal story. I was always following it on social, and you went down this path. Like first, let me hit pause and say, I struggle at times just trying to find consistent training, because when you do it for a living, you're like, man, the last thing I want to do is write up my own training program or go to the gym, because like I just was around this all day. But what I did observe over you recently, or we can talk about when, but you were on this path of trying to do a two-handed dunk for basketball, which I found super fun, because I'm like, whoa, Trev, like, can you really dunk? Like, come on, you're not the tallest white dude that I know.
Nope, I'm not.
But then also, like, I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like, probably gives you motivation, because when, like I said, when you don't have a program, or you're just, you need to work out, it's part of the job, but trying to cater that to what you do with your day to day, I just thought it was really cool. So really just wanted to ask you about it, and like two kind of questions come to mind. Like, what was that experience like for you doing it for yourself?
Yeah.
But then also, like, how did you find the whole training process as you were going through it?
Well, part of it was like, playing college football. Like, I weighed at my heaviest, I was like 240 in college, and I was always like I loved squatting and hang cleaning. I loved just like lifting weights. That was just my thing for, from time I was like 14 years old, like through college, and even, I did a little Olympic lifting, did a couple Olympic lifting competitions after college. I was into that for a little bit. And then I was in like a really weird spot where I was like, I was no longer 240. I wasn't as strong as I was. I was like 215, 220, and like not as strong as I was, like not really lean either, just kind of in like this weird, like in between phase. So then I, did some like nutrition stuff and lost some weight. And then like, I realized that I still had like some of my athleticism, because I was always a decent mover. I was pretty fast. I could jump a little bit. And I always wanted to dunk. Like, that was since, I was a kid. I was like, man, dunking was like, the amount of time I would spend on like that, the basketball hoop hanging on your door, just like dunking when I was a kid, was like 90% of my like free time when I was young. So that was just always something I kind of wanted to do. And then COVID hit, and I had a lot of free time. It was interesting because, being, I can't remember what the word actually is, but like we could still work because we were medical providers, right? Or I can't remember what the word is.
Essential. We were essential.
Yeah, essential employee. So I still came, and I had like 3 or 4 people that had just had surgery. So like they like needed to be seen. So I came in like Monday, Wednesday, Friday during COVID, and I would like go grocery shop in the morning, and I would have like 3 hours after that to like train, and then I would see my clients, and I would go home. So I had a really nice like Monday, Wednesday split. And at that point, I was kind of sick of lifting weights. I was, I had done it so much, it just wasn't appealing to me that much anymore. And my vertical was starting to improve, and I was feeling bouncy. So then I just, kind of tested myself. And I think my first time on like an approach jump, I touched like 10.3.5, 10.4. I'm like, oh, that's not bad, whatever. And then started training and just, messing around with it more, understanding like the mechanics of a 2-foot jump and things like that. And then by probably within like 12 months, I touched 10.10. So I put on like 6.5 inches on my vertical, and I could do a 2-foot one-handed dunk. My goal still, once I get over some of these Achilles issues, is I want to be able to do a 2-foot two-hand dunk, and then maybe one day if I get a little more springy, I can do a 1-foot two-handed dunk. That's kind of the ultimate goal for me. Yeah, I mean, it just gave me something to train for. Like, it was super fun. I didn't feel as beat up in like my back and my knees and my hips from squatting and deadlifting and all kind of stuff. And I love the athleticism of people that can dunk, and I thought it was really cool. And honestly, like, part of it for me as well is like, I want to be able to, demoing in my day-to-day life of working with my clients is so important. So I don't really ever want to lose a step. I don't want to lose any of my athleticism, because I try to demo at full speed as much as I possibly can, so people can understand like what high intensity actually looks like. Because I think for me, it was the same way. Like, high school athletes, I think they think they're pushing themselves, they think they're going hard, but they don't really know what full intensity, max speed, max, like full force kind of like jumping looks like. So to be able to demo that and have a decent vertical or a decent broad jump is honestly pretty important to me.
No, I mean, you got to walk the walk. I always, it's like the analogy of, are you going to take dietary advice from the overweight doc?
Yeah,
It's like,
sure.
I think that as much as we don't want to acknowledge it, like there is some street cred when you look the part and can kind of walk the walk a little bit. Now, like, I worked in the NBA, like I never even tried to even do a two-hand dunk because I'm like, why am I going to even try with these guys? They'll just do windmills over me, right? But I remember like in soccer days, like at least be able to like, hey, let me make sure like I can at least like, how's my first touch? Like I know these guys are going to
Yeah.
kick the ball at me, so like it builds up that kind of rapport with you too. So I just found it so cool. It's like, oh man, Trev's just getting after it over there. I'm like watching
Yeah.
from Soul shows. Like it was pretty cool. It's great to hear you enjoyed it too, man. You
Oh, yeah.
actually got pretty close too.
No, it's something I need to get back to. I've had that and just a combination of how much more like running and jumping stuff I was doing. Like my right Achilles got pretty lit up, so I had a surgery on that, and then my left Achilles is pretty lit up right now, so I'm going through some treatment stuff on that. But once I'm full speed again, I'm definitely going to get back out there, and I will get a two-handed dunk at some point in my life.
Love the vote. You have my vote of confidence. I know you will.
That.
Hey, so more on like on a more professional note, like I think I brought you on here because, like I mentioned earlier, you, Greg, Doug, the crew at Resilient, have built this reputation in my eyes and others in the industry that know what y'all are about of really being good at the return to play process or the return to sport process, return to performance. Choose your phrase of choice.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to bring you on here is kind of because you guys are writing a book right now for Human Kinetics about return to sport. So I just think it's really timely. Okay, you guys are in the middle of writing the book. I know these guys are good at what they do. Let's have a deep dive on what return to play is. Now, I have a list of questions that we can go through, but I really just want to open the conversation up to you. Is first off, why did you guys start to write the book, and where are you guys at in the process?
Yeah, I mean, the book was something that we were always kind of interested in doing it. And when I created our return to sport acceleration and agility course a few years back, like I had written this super giant script for my PowerPoint presentation, and even when as I was writing it, I'm like, I could definitely turn this into a book at some point in time. Like it would take some changes and some editing, obviously, but it's definitely something I was kind of interested in. And then Human Kinetics approached us about writing a book, and we discussed the return to sport stuff with them. And Corey Van Wyck was the guy who kind of initially approached us, and he had been hoping for a book like that to kind of come into the space for a while. And we, he asked us what does that book kind of look like from a table of contents? We pitched them what we think our table of contents would look like, and they were cool with it. They signed off on it. So we've been writing the book for over a year now. We're in the editing stage of our first draft, if you will. So we're kind of getting feedback from their editors on just some changes. And yeah, I mean, it's been a really cool thing. It's something I'm super passionate about. So are Greg and Doug. And I think it's going to be a really important book for practitioners, whether you're a physical therapist working more of the rehab end, whether you're a strength coach doing more kind of end stage, or somebody like us, where in our setting we get to kind of do both. We take people from acute, day 1 to day 5 post-op, and we see people through being cleared to actually get back on the field or the court. So it's been a really cool process so far.
And speaking of street cred, you guys, like you just said, you guys have the credibility and the practicality of it too. Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, like in the way I think about this, but there's in the world of physical therapy and rehab, there's the clinical side, but then there's the practical side too.
Totally.
And I think you guys do a really good job of respecting the clinical side when need be, but also you guys are super creative, and you've created the system and process to the practical part. Because like a phrase you guys used to have in podcasts, you guys was like, hey, just keep it real. Right. Yeah. Like there's all these theories and ideas you see on social or come out of research papers. And then you talk to the people actually are in the trenches doing the work. It's like, yeah, that sounds great. It came out of a research study, but what's actually practical? So I'm really excited for you guys to launch this, because I know it'll be valuable to the industry, because I do believe it's a gap in the market. I'm glad someone needed to write it, and I'm glad it's you guys.
Appreciate
so with that, what I want to hear is kind of just walk me through the thought process of how you and the crew at Resilient approach the return to sport process. So I think the first question I would ask you is are there key principles or key ideas that are the foundations to what you guys believe in and how you approach a case?
That's a great question. I mean, there's so many parts to that. I think starting the return to sport process, regardless of the injury, with the end stage in mind, is super important, because we have to understand what athletes actually need to be able to do when they are playing their sport. I think a lot of times we lose we almost get too focused on the return to sport tests, which don't necessarily, not that they don't matter, but they're not indicative of what somebody actually needs to be able to do on their sport. Most return to sport tests don't have actual agility, don't have change of direction, don't have hard change of direction work, they don't have max velocity work, they just don't involve the intensity, the forces, the dynamics that the sport actually does. So it's, it's like the triple hop test is a great test. It should be done. It's important. But like, just because someone can do a triple hop test doesn't mean that they're actually the kind of play their sport. So I think for us, it's trying to look at the totality of like what the person needs to be able to do in that no longer in a rehab scenario, right? They're in practice, they're scrimmaging, they're playing in games, like understanding what that involves from a movement patterns, of movement skills, intensity, force, velocity, all those qualities is super, super important. And then it's understanding how do we kind of reverse engineer what that end stage actually looks like to help build them up. So, one of the things that we always kind of talk about is if you look at most post-op protocols that are typically written by surgeons who, no offense to surgeons, like they're great at what they do, but they don't understand the rehab process. They don't understand, like programming in the sense of what qualities kind of help build on one another. And oftentimes, like running comes way earlier before any sort of plyometric activity does. And then it'll be like, oftentimes I've seen like agility, which if you understand what agility actually is, comes before running. And it's like, that also just doesn't make any sense at all. So, but if you don't know better and you're following the surgeon's protocol, you're kind of like, you're mixing the timing, or I should say mixing up the timing of when these things kind of should actually be done. So it's like, they're like doing like mile runs and pounding their joints, and they're pounding their tissues that aren't ready for that type of volume, that type of intensity. Because even though it's like a slow velocity type of run, they're going at 8, 9, 10-minute miles, but they're accumulating 2 to 3 miles. It's like the volume just doesn't make any sense because they've done zero preparation for running. Like running, we think is easy, but running is actually very hard from a load standpoint. So, for us, it's understanding like, okay, when does the timing of these activities actually kind of make sense? And then what are the preparatory activities for this thing that we're kind of doing in the return or sport process? So for like example, running, typically for us, for our post-op people, depends on a lot of factors, but like take an ACL, typically like they're running somewhere between 12 and 16 weeks is we're doing some of our running progressions, depending on the surgeon's, do's and don'ts. But it's like, so before they're running, we are hopefully have done a few weeks at least of extensive double leg and single leg plyo, so we can know that they can handle the ground contact forces that they're going to have to tolerate for running. And then again, we're kind of going more on like the speed end of things, the acceleration end of things, rather than accumulating a ton of volume, of course. Because I would say most post-op cases like don't tolerate accumulating a ton of volume from a running standpoint very well. Patella tendons flare up for a lot of ACL kids, and maybe they may incur more joint swelling just because the total workload is so much higher. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question technically, but I think it's just understanding like where are we trying to go from the end stage, and then how do we kind of work backwards, and what's the like logical, appropriate way to work back from the end stage to the beginning.
There's so much that we're going to double click on in there, because there was a lot of things that I know at a high level, but you said it so simple, but I don't think as many people have the experience and breadth of knowledge that you do. So first thing I want to do, one thing I heard you talk about was timelines. And
sorry, say that again, was what?
One thing I heard you talk about was timelines.
Yes.
Okay. So, in sport, timelines is a very big thing when you're talking about missed games and thousands, if not millions of dollars. That was the world that I lived in. But also for you, like that's important too, because you want to do right by the athlete. So there's two particular words that come to mind when you talk about timelines. There's the biology, and then there's the criteria. So really curious how within the framework that y'all are working with, that you work with, how are you balancing biology, meaning biological healing times? For example, we know a bone takes anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to heal, despite no matter how many modalities you throw at. There's just kind of a timeline from biology. From a criteria perspective, we're talking about some of the things that you alluded to as far as, okay, a triple hop test. We're talking about single leg strength. We're talking about max velocity, change of direction speeds. That being more criteria based on, like you alluded to, what the demands are for what they have to be able to do. So to round that context into a singular question for you, how do you balance criteria versus biology during return to sport?
It's also such a, it's so case dependent in the sense that people, I like, we're always respecting biology first. I think that like that healing timeline is real. Like there is, if you just had a surgery a week ago, I don't want to do really high intensity, high velocity type movements, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense. The tissue's not ready for it. So that's definitely a piece of it. But, sorry, I had a notification go off. So like understanding the biology first and understanding healing timelines first is super critical. Like we wouldn't want to be loading the type of activities that we do in kind of the middle and later stages of our return to sport process. We wouldn't do those earlier on because the tissues just physically aren't ready for it. So we have to have some time for those tissues to adapt. But there's still like activities that we can do to healing tissues that can allow us to drive the adaptations that we're looking for. So, like use patella tendon ACL graft is a super common one where kids have, tons of anterior knee discomfort, I would say sometimes pain post-op, and it can last for a super, super long time. We can still load that tissue. Maybe we're not doing really high, high intensity, like high velocity, high angular velocity, like knee extensions earlier on, but we can be doing different pushing and holding isometrics just to help cause some adaptation across that healing tendon, right? To help like Wolf's Law type, put some force or put some stress across that area, but also help to desensitize the knee. So that's an example of like the tendon's healing, but we're still kind of going after our criteria. We're like, I have to get this athlete's quad strong. Because what often happens, and I've seen this in cases that have been kind of punted to us, where the person's 6 months out. So by 6 months, they should definitely be running, but their running looks terrible because their quad's so weak because they haven't done anything. So they're healed, quote unquote, but from a criteria standpoint, they're not ready to be running because they haven't established the baselines or the benchmarks or the foundation that will allow them to actually run. So the biology healing part of it to me is like kind of simple in the sense that like that's usually governed by the protocols themselves, where they don't want this type of activity. Sometimes it's no open chain knee extensions until week 12 or 16 or whatever it is, just because that's what the surgeon wants. So we have to follow those timelines sometimes. But yeah, like the biology and the healing part is super important. We can't ignore that, but we can still be chasing the benchmarks that we know we need for each phase of the return to sport process while we're still respecting biology.
No, respect biology is got to be the number one thing, because if you don't, then you keep chasing the criteria, you're just going to be in a space of taking one step forward, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
But there's all like the flip side of that coin to me is the people that only care about the biology, right? Because I've seen there's cases where kids are either getting cleared or not getting cleared based upon the timeline. And I think that's also a problem, because I have seen kids where, like, I had a kid, he was going into his freshman year of high school, did great, looked amazing. He was 14 years old, so they were keeping him at a minimum of 10 months out post-op. The kid, from a criteria standpoint, was ready at 8 because he looked really good. Wait till 10. I'm totally cool with that, whatever. Go to 10 months, he goes to his follow-up. It looks great. And he's like, you look amazing. I would clear, but I think it'd be better if you wait till 18 months. And it's like, well, why? What are we waiting for now? Like, if this kid's, is he going to be that much more healed in another 8 months? Is that really going to make that much of a difference? Or there's people that I have seen people that have gotten cleared and they are not ready, but they're 10 months out, so they get cleared, but they haven't passed the criteria. So there's this kind of, we have to look at both. We have to understand the healing timeline thing, but ultimately, in my eyes, if they are not passing any of the criteria, whatever that is, everyone has their own definition of what they think is important from a criteria standpoint, then they shouldn't be getting cleared, even if they're 2 years out of their surgery.
The idea of the criteria and being such a gray space, right? I think like there was a research review I pulled for a presentation one time. It was like lateral ankle sprains, return to play. There's a systematic review. There is no consistent criteria to clear someone for return to play, which is why I think it's so important that you guys are writing this book. So if we talk about criteria, I think you did a great job highlighting biology, and we recognize what those kind of timelines are. There's a lot of good surgeons that have looked into the literature as far as what those timelines are and what we are. But from a criteria perspective, what are kind of the big rocks? I know you mentioned you guys like to reverse engineer from what they have to do, but we're all talking about athletes, and let's just rule out the overhead athlete and the pitcher. Like we know, like throwing volume is specific to them, but in general, 80% of the athletes probably all need to demonstrate similar things. What would be the big rocks for the criteria, just to give context to the audience as far as, hey, when you're thinking about writing the program, think about it from this criteria of the end goal, what are those big rocks for your criteria?
So like my end stage rehab type of, I don't have, there's sort of court to call. I don't really have like, there's a bunch of numbers a person needs to hit, right? So like I would, and this should happen earlier on, like their quad asymmetry should be really, less than 10% ideally by make up a month. I don't care, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, whatever it is. Their asymmetry with a double leg counter movement jump should be less than 15%, hopefully less than 10%. The braking and the propulsive phases should all look good, right? There's all of those like kind of general things that I want and that I look for, but like ultimately I want my athletes by the time they're getting cleared to be able to sprint in a way and like achieve velocities that are close to their peers. And this was a phrase that I heard Rob Panarello say years ago that has always kind of stuck with me is it's like, basically it's like, can they be to the level of their peers? So if they're going to get back to high school football and the average, I'm making this up, that the average play speed of a high school football game is 14 miles an hour, and this person, their top speed is 14 miles an hour, well, they're probably not going to be that effective on the field. So they probably can't match the level of their peers. So I want them to be able to hit a velocity from a max velocity standpoint that will allow them to be impactful in their sport. And it's going to be dependent on the sport, the position, on a number of factors. Kind of same thing with acceleration. I want to make sure they have really good acceleration and deceleration quality. So the change of direction work looks good. They use strategies that are appropriate. They can have a braking impulse and transition to a propulsive impulse on that involved leg. They don't have to use their opposite side to unload their involved limb, which is a strategy I see all the time with change of direction and agility work. And then if they're a sport where there is a lot of jumping, that like they actually do have a good vertical, because the output of the vertical probably matters. So even if they could look really good in terms of the force plate metrics type stuff from a strategy standpoint, but if their output is 8 inches below everyone else on their team, then again they're probably just not ready to play. Like their outputs aren't high enough to be able to play their sport. Because a lot of times I think in the internal sport world we get focused on symmetry and all of these things that are really important, but ultimately like the outputs are why people play. Like the outputs are one of the things that really allow people to get back to the sport and to be effective. Like you could feel great, you may move super symmetrically, but if you're slow and you're weak, like it doesn't really matter. So those things are important. I want people to be symmetrical, whatever that means. I want people to move well, whatever that means, but they also need to be fast, they need to be explosive, they got to be able to change directions quickly.
So what I heard was sprint, accelerate, jump, move well.
Yeah.
And strength strength underpins every single one of those.
Exactly. And that's why like one of the biggest, I think mistakes is like people don't get strong enough during the return to sport process. And I think oftentimes that's kind of like, it's the fault of the rehab, like the physical therapy centric things, because they spend so much time, like just not, they don't spend enough time loading is really what I should say, where we've had kids get sent to a 6 months post-op and they're super weak in their quad. And I'm like, what's the heaviest thing you've done? They're like, oh, I did, a 50-pound leg press. It's like, okay, well, that's not very impressive. And you're 6 months post-op, and that's the only thing that you've done. And you're, 175-pound, like high school male, like you should probably be able to leg press more than 50 pounds, like single leg press more than 50 pounds, right? So there's just like I think the hard part when it comes to creating the criteria and some of the standards is just like, especially at like the high school level, it's so variable, right? Like the same physical sized male or female could have wildly different strength characteristics just depending on like the person's genetic potential and what type of athlete that they are. Right? I've had people, roughly the same size, but like the strength that one person's capable of is triple the person right next to him that's the exact same size. So I think that's why I have a trouble when we talk about like creating the standards, because even if you do the standards based off of somebody's body weight, like it's still too variable. Like it's just really variable, and then the standards then just become really low if you're trying to incorporate everybody to get them to pass it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. That's why I asked the question around like principles and foundational ideas, because if you can root yourself in those and like everything you just said to critically think, you can get to a spot to be able to have that program. One thing I wanted to just piggyback on, and I agree with this sentiment, is the idea that like you get a guy, you've used this example a couple of times now, is you see someone 6 months, and we're talking about someone that maybe had like a knee surgery, whether it be meniscus repair, meniscectomy, ACL, combination of everything, right? They're coming off of knee surgery. You guys are getting the cases that are punted because let's just say they've been failed by the traditional model that may exist in the rehab world, and you guys get them in 6 months in, and they're talking about running, but they don't even have the requisite strength. The question I want to ask you is just if you've seen this in practice. I have found that there's so much pressure and so much salesman and marketing around how fast can I get you to run and jump, that like that becomes the goal, almost to skip over some of those things. I was like, oh yeah, you can run in 3 months, but it looks like absolute dog shit. And you're totally. Like, well, then now we need to be able to build up the strength again to be able to have you run. So I just really like throw that on you. Is like, have you observed the same thing?
Totally. Yeah. And it sucks for those kids to kind of tell them that they're not ready for that right now, and what in their mind is regressing, right? Because they're like, well, I'm no longer spending the majority of my session with you like running and doing the athletic stuff with like whatever they think their end stage kind of rehab is. But like we would be doing them a disservice by adding tons of volume and running intensity, running velocity, change of direction intensity to them when they're really not physically, they don't have the physical capacity to be able to actually tolerate those forces or to handle those forces well. Where all of a sudden they're using really like, just non-positive adaptation type of strategies, right? Really stiff limbs to slow themselves down. They don't have good eccentric control of their quad or whatever quality we're kind of saying. It's like, that's the kind of stuff that if we don't, in their mind, regress them, in my mind, we're not regressing them. I'm just getting strong, right? Like I'm actually going to help you take 3 steps forward instead of taking a half a step forward over the next 6 weeks. So I think, yeah, there's definitely times and place where if the person's not physically ready for that activity, like we have to make the safe decision and the smart decision by kind of reversing course and going back to like the beginning, if you will, and really focusing on just some of those really fundamental strength qualities that athletes need. Because it's like, I don't care how strong, it's like all of these things we're kind of talking about, sprinting, change direction, whatever. You said it before, like it comes down to strength and force production. That's a huge part of it. There has to be like somewhat of a ceiling that they can reach. And then it's about how fast can they reach that relative ceiling. It's like, I don't care how, so if these RFD, these rate of force development qualities are really important, which they are for all movements in the athletic world, right? In sports, it's like, I don't care how strong you aren't. I don't care how much little force you can produce really fast. Like that doesn't matter. That's not gonna help you when you actually get on the field. So we have to regress them and get them really strong, and then work on those rate of force development qualities, and then work on our speed and agility, acceleration, change direction, all that good stuff, all the fun stuff.
Yeah, that's the fun stuff. Absolutely. One thing we haven't talked about, I'm curious if you guys have the capabilities or you guys include it somewhere, is just the idea of capacity and the idea of fitness, for lack of better terms, right? There's a lot of research that suggests, hey, fatigue is a strong indicator or predictor or modifiable risk factor for injury. So relative to the rehab process, I've seen some methodologies out there is like, hey, like I'm going to try and tire you out, and then we're going to work on movement coordination while you're tired. Or, maybe from traditional periodization models, so you kind of go through a very big GPP program to build up big capacity across all athletic qualities. So really curious if if you guys in your practice have the ability to address capacity or fitness, and if you do, how do you guys do it?
I would say this is probably the part that I think about, or I have been thinking about a lot lately, and something I want to get better with, because I would say I do a good job of getting my athletes strong, moving well, being quick, all that good stuff. I think part of it is like the constraints that we have in our model in terms of like, we have an hour a couple times a week. You can give people stuff to do on their outside, which we do. I think the like true more end stage type of conditioning capacity is something I need to do a better job of with my athletes, where I do incorporate it, but I still think I'm biased towards leaning on the intensity end of the spectrum over the capacity end of the spectrum, where I have them do some, long duration aerobic stuff on their own to work on some aerobic capacity. But I think from a true, like more sport specific conditioning standpoint is an area I can definitely improve on. Not that I don't include it, but I often look at, I need to get them to be able to handle the intensities that they need in their sport more than the volume of it. Partly because my recommendations for when people go back to practice is I look at how I can control their volume in practice as more of the specific conditioning rather than what I'm going to do with have them do in my sessions with me. If that kind of makes sense. So it's like I don't want to spend 20 minutes doing this specific work to rest ratio that's kind of more sports specific for this individual athlete in my session. I'd rather work on their actual max velocity or acceleration work or stuff where they kind of like need my eye more. But then oftentimes it kind of just gets like pushed to the side or it becomes not the primary focus when maybe it does need to be. But that doesn't mean that we're not working on capacity the whole time. Doing a lot of change, like high intensity change of direction work is not one of my favorite things to do under much fatigue. I don't think it ends well. And I think we kind of ingrain like shitty movement patterns with people. When I do my change of direction in agility work, I'm in my head, I'm working more in that kind of sport specific model where like we're doing 3 to 4 hard changes of direction in 5 seconds. And we're not, right. It's not 35 really slow, crappy cuts with a bunch of braking steps before each change of direction over this course of 30 seconds, because that doesn't happen in 90% of team sports. So we're kind of working on some of that specific work capacity in the change of direction in the drills that we're doing, but I don't dedicate as much time to building capacity that I think some athletes.
I think you answered it beautifully because you have constraints on you, what you can do, right? If you have an hour with a client, do you really want to spend 20 to 30 minutes working on capacity work when that's something that's pretty mundane and doesn't require a lot of supervision that you can prescribe elsewhere? So I appreciate you, but I also understand where your head was at. And I agree with the idea of intensity over volume. And that's the way I've approached it too, because I look at it this way. If you can hit the intensities, right, then it's just a matter of repeating that. But if you can't hit the intensities and you try chasing capacity, you're going to hit a ceiling at some point. And like you said, probably not going to be able to compete with your peers. So I appreciate you highlighting that. And that's something that I've seen to be successful too in the space.
And I would add, for like most of us in the private sector, like you work with, like a large part of our population is like high school athletes in certain times of the year, a lot more college guys, some pro guys, things like that. But it's most high school sport coaches, I think, over condition. So it's like they kind of get the conditioning aspect, and it's not always good conditioning in terms of what they're actually working on. It's a lot of just like run people in the ground but whatever. But like they're getting more of just a work capacity type of things in practice in their sport, which is why like one of my recommendations often is for kids. Like you go back to practice, you're just doing individual skill work at first, whatever that looks like in their sport. Maybe some small sided games, you build up the small sided games, but you're not scrimmaging, and then you can do the conditioning at the end. I think that's a really good way to kind of them to get more of just overall volume that they do need, and they have to be able to tolerate that. But again, it takes kind of out of my hands, and like you said, then I don't have to spend a big chunk of my session watching them, run just for running's sake.
Just running some doggies. You don't want to get in line with them.
It's like
I'm curious what like your response to this question. You guys are writing this book, and you guys have been spending a lot of time pulling back the curtain on your guys' own methodology and interventions, right? And you alluded to some case studies that have come your way that, for lack of better words, have failed in other sectors, and you guys it's your job to now fix the problem. So I would be really curious, like, what do you believe is the current state of the industry of return to play, and then where do you hope it goes to?
Interesting question. I think like the current state is a lot of people not understanding what the end stage of return to sport actually is, right? Like, again, not understanding the demands of the game. I think that is always what I come back to. It's like we can't adequately prepare somebody if we don't know what we're actually preparing them for. So people just kind of end up preparing them for the tests that they need to be cleared. The tests aren't indicative of their ability to handle the stresses and the velocity, intensity, whatever volume of the game itself. So I think that's kind of one piece of it. I also think there's a very weird, unfortunate case of people kind of passing the buck. to other practitioners, in the sense that, you know, there needs to be, whether it's people don't do some of the activities that need to be done to adequately prepare an athlete just because they don't know, or they don't because there is some risk involved. And I will admit, like, if most people were to watch me do what I do with my athletes, it wouldn't look like physical therapy to them. Like, it would look like, oh, I would never have, I want my athlete to, in our sessions, be doing something that intense, that has that much risk, right? Like a athletes get hurt, change direction, unfortunately, in sports. But to get better at change of direction and to be able to do it well when you get in the field, like, you have to practice it. So we build up to it, but we're doing super high intensity, hard changes of direction. There is risk involved with that. So I think there is times where practitioners either don't do it because they don't know how to progress somebody to that level, or because it's risky. So then these athletes just get under prepared because they don't want to be, whoever's working with them doesn't want them to get hurt in their sessions, which no one does. Like, I get that. But then the athlete ends up paying the price where they're just not prepared for their sport. So I think, it's like the PT is like, well, the strength coach will do that kind of for them later on. And then sometimes the strength coach is like, well, they'll get that stuff in practice. So it's like, I'm not going to do it. So the sport coach is just going to be the one who kind of has, going to take care of some of the change direction or agility work or whatever it is. So then the athlete just never really gets exposed to it. And the only time they're exposed to it is in the game, and then they're not prepared for it, and then they get hurt. So either, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, some athletes are just robust enough that they can survive, and they end up getting back to the sport without having done the requisite things, and they're okay and they don't get hurt. Or they're robust enough and they survive and they aren't prepared for the sport and they get back. But then once the intensity of the game is there, which we cannot replicate in our world, like, I don't really care what we do unless we have, a 5-on-5 basketball that we're like playing with these guys, which we're not. But once you get back to the sport, like, the intensity is just so much higher and they're not ready for it, that they get hurt again. Whether it's the same injury, whether it's something else, whether it's a soft tissue injury, whether, whatever it is, I think that's kind of what we see. So I hope that we get to a point where there's just better communication between the practitioners to handle these athletes' care, right? From the surgeon and their team to the rehab team, to the strength coach, if there is one involved, the sport coach, if there is one involved, like, to be able to actually have communication where these athletes, where each practitioner knows their role and they know what the athlete is and is not prepared for and what they kind of need next. And then, just to have, in an ideal world, like we've kind of touched on a little bit, like, there is some criteria, right? Like we do have some criteria, but I don't really know what that actually looks like. And I don't know if I believe that there ever will be one, because it's an N of one, I think, for each athlete. Like, it could be the same position, the same level of sport, just same injury, but people just respond to things like so differently. People adapt to things so differently that we have to respect, like, the individual athlete and kind of like what makes them good. Because to be able, there needs to be some standards to be able to get back to their sport. But there's also, if you're to look at like healthy athletes within a sport, the range of what their outputs are that we're trying to measure is going to be huge. Like, like in your setting, I'm sure with all the force plate testing of these professional basketball players, I'm sure like the range of what the outputs are and the, all the metrics we can get from our force plates. It's like, there is no standard. There is probably a median, but like, what's the floor? What's our minimum threshold that we're saying that athletes healthy enough to get back to their sport? I don't know if we have that for anything right now, which is okay. But I think we just need to have the ability to have honest conversations with everybody involved and be comfortable knowing what we don't know and asking questions and searching for more answers, but also not becoming dogmatic and assuming that there is like one answer, that there is one test, that there is one exercise or whatever. Like, the every day I see a kid from whatever day post-op until they get back to their sport, like, is a test. It's an assessment of kind of where they are, what are they comfortable with, what can they do, what can they not do. And with enough exposures over time to seeing these athletes and taking kids through stuff, like, I'm comfortable and confident thinking, knowing somebody is ready to go play their sport or not. And it's oftentimes not solely because of like tests that we did, right? Not because of our force plate numbers, not because of our strength numbers, not because of whatever, like all that stuff kind of comes into play, but it's like observing people move and run and sprint and jump. Like, if we all get better at that, I think we'll be able to help people get back to their sport in a way that they're safer, first off, but also going to be more effective when they get back on the field.
I would love to maybe this is a part two, and I think we could dive deep on this, but I want to challenge the idea of not knowing what the criteria are. And the reason I asked that question is the way my mind works when it comes to the criteria aspect. Before I go there, I want to say thank you for providing context and providing perspective on the state of return to play. Because the idea of risk averse, I never thought of that. Just in the environments I've worked, that just hasn't been a thing, because we just know, like, this is what we got to do. If you don't do it, you're just not going to play and you're not going to make money. But I appreciate you highlighting that, because I could see that being a sticking point in the public and private sector. But I want to come back to the question of the idea of criterion, where I don't want to, like I said, maybe this is part two, but I want to just bring this to light of where I lean into the literature around longevity, and I read into the literature around injury risk mitigation, right? There's a lot of research. Let's just use a very simple two factors. You look at VO2 max and you look at strength. We know that the larger your VO2 max is and the stronger you are, more likely going to live longer than someone that's of less of capacity and less stronger than you. Vice versa, in the performance world, those that have a higher capacity and a higher strength tend to get, in comparison, at the end of a season, those who had injuries and didn't have injuries, the more fit and more stronger athletes tended to get injured less. So whatever that means, doesn't necessarily mean everyone should have this VO2 max or have this strength, but I do believe we can get to a space where you tie in some concepts from other fields, other ideas beyond the physical therapy world and the rehab world, and say, okay, I agree with you on the force plate. I think force plate data is still too early, still too noisy to really have metrics. You can kind of look at populations and normative data there and bell curves and standard deviation, sure. But I think for humans, I think we might be able to get to a space where we can effectively say, hey, just as like the floor that you need to hit for strength, maybe you got to be able to squat 1.5 times your body weight. We've kind of seen that number thrown out numerous times in literature. From a conditioning perspective, maybe you can't run a VO2 max test with a metabolic cart or a portable metabolic unit, but there are some field-based tests that say, hey, you know what? Healthy athletes in this population probably are standing around, 52, 54 milliliters per kilogram for VO2 max. Maybe then what that relates to a field-based test, just as like a base to say, hey, this is the floor that you should at least hit before you even consider X athletic activity. So I just wanted to throw that at you and just maybe get your perspective briefly. And like I said, maybe this is just a deeper dive that we can have on another episode.
I don't disagree with you in the sense that I think it would be awesome to be able to have some of those metrics. And I think that idea of like, whatever the capacity test is, whatever the strength test is can be so powerful and can mean so much. The question, like where my head always kind of goes with, though, like the 1.5 times body weight squat thing, right? Like I think it's a great number. How many athletes in the NBA can 1.5 times body weight squat themselves? Like you worked in that environment. I haven't. But I think about that, if you have a 300-pound athlete in the NBA, not that there's that many of them, can they squat 450? I don't know.
It's a valid point, and
right?
I think, but I think where to speak from experience, there's fear of performing maximal tests of getting injured.
Right.
But I do know there's a lot of software out there and some tech companies that when you employ their technology, let's just use like eNote or Output Sports, right? From a velocity-based training, you can predict. And we have the charts that say, okay, if you do this at this, you can predict. So I think perhaps you may be able to, if you use some prediction models, may be able to extrapolate that. I'm with you. I don't know if there's many NBA athletes that can tolerate that, because now you get into this is where like I knew this is where I should not ask this question.
No,
it's
a great discussion, man.
Because then you get in the path of like, well, are they, are you a gorilla? Are you a kangaroo? Are you muscular driven, tendons driven? Are you more fascial driven? Are you more force driven? Right? Like all those conversations start to ask. And I think that's where we get that's the exciting part, but it's also the confusing part too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I like to lean into like the people that we look up to in the sprint space, like Altis. I think one phrase I appreciate Dan Paff, teaching a long time ago is like, there's got to be bandwidths of movement that are acceptable. Like every athlete's not going to move the same way. Every sprinter is not going to sprint the same way, but there's got to be bandwidth. So I hope, as I'm piggybacking off the question I asked you, I hope the industry gets to a space where we can, as technology and data is becoming more mainstream and machine learning and artificial intelligence is starting to layer into a lot of what we do. Like, I just hope we can get to that space, to your point, to mitigate, to provide a solution for those that may be risk averse, that there's an opportunity to say, hey, you know what? This is your age range. This is what you need to be able to hit from basic, let's just say, force production and maybe capacity. Maybe you can tie in some velocity stuff, but I know that it's a lot more complex. But I just, the optimism in me just got to say, man, we got to get there. And I think we can. I think we can.
No, I agree. I think it's like, that's the hard part. It's like, we need standards. What are the standards? Because there needs to be like something objective, but then that range, like you said, like the bandwidth, there just needs to be a bandwidth. But in my mind, I'm like, that bandwidth needs to be like per individual, not necessarily for a test or for a, whatever. Like, it's like, I have high school girls that, I have a girl who's like 10 weeks post-op, and she could easily goblet squat half her body weight for like a set of 8 or 10 right now, which is really strong, for especially being 10 weeks post-op and her quad's still weak and whatever. But it's like, I have other girls who we have trained for months and months and months and months and months and months and months to be able to get to the point where she's, can probably goblet squat half her body weight for a set of 4 or 5, and it's still pretty hard. But does that mean she's not ready? Does that mean she's not further along? It's like, we just look at tests to mean tests are just proxies for something else that we're kind of looking for, right? It's like the test itself like doesn't matter to me. It does, because it tells me something, but like, the test does not mean that the person will be really fast. Sprinting is going to tell you if the person's really fast, right? It's like change of direction, like watching somebody cut is going to tell me whether or not they can cut really well. It's not going to be, like some other test. Like, there's things that can give me some pieces of it, like a single leg counter move jump is really important for me from like a force plate testing to understand somebody's change of direction qualities, capacities, things like that. But it doesn't tell me whether or not they can do what I want them to do when we actually put them in the environment and the situation to, stick that left foot in the ground and cut really hard off of it. Like, it's important, but it doesn't tell me the whole picture.
1,000% agree with you. I love the expression you said, like, test as a proxy for something else. Like, that's pretty much what all testing is, unless you're actually doing the physical thing as like the athletic, right? Like, the thing is the thing. Like, let the main thing be the main thing. But there has to be, to your point, proxies that provide validity to what they need to do, or in a controlled manner versus the chaotic environment of sport, that allow us to just safely say, okay, I at least know you can tolerate the fundamentals of what this is. Like, that's probably what a lot of the tests that you're referring to are actually doing. They're not necessarily saying you do this test, you're clear. No, it's like, this is giving us information to say you're safe to be able to execute these more advanced athletic movements, but you still got to execute those more advanced athletic movements at high velocities, high speeds. I think that's where, if I could summarize before we keep going down this rabbit hole, I would hit.
The last thing I would add is just like, that's why, like, we always talk about, it's like, our tests are just our progressions, right?
Yes.
It's like my jumping progression, my plyometric progression tells me whether or not somebody's ready for something. Like, I'm not going to have somebody do, single leg bounding until we've done a broad jump, until we've done a rebound broad jump, until we've done a 2-leg broad jump to a single leg stick, or a 1 foot to, right? There's all these different progressions that we can have that like increase the demand upon whatever we're trying to stress. That if an athlete is able to go through these progressions and perform well based upon whatever model movement we have as a practitioner, then they're probably safe for like that next level, that next progression, that next whatever it is. But unless people are going through the appropriate progressions, like, that's the test. If people aren't going through the appropriate progressions, I think it's really hard to have like a test day where somebody is then cleared or not,
I love that the progression is the test, because if you're aware of what you're doing from a stressor and a stimulus and a volume and intensity within your programming, then you should be able to confidently say, like, I would expect you to get this on the test. I don't need the test. I do the test to confirm my hypothesis. That's the reason you do test. But to your point, the progression is the test. So then, I would imagine if you had no technology available to you, and based on the progression models you had during a certain stage, you'd be able to say, he's probably he or she is probably ready for this, but not because of that, because on this last day of training, we did X, Y, and Z, and this is a regression of this. So I feel like
Totally.
I share that same sentiment. I appreciate you saying that, because I think that needs to be heard, that like detailed, good programming, your progressions become the test. That's perfect, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, hey, man, we are getting close on time here, and I'm so bummed. Like I said, I think we're going to have, maybe when the book comes out, we'll have to get all three of you on here, because one, that would just be super fun. But then two, it'd be really cool to see what the book came out of and where you guys got, because correct me if I'm wrong, each of you are writing different parts of the book. It's not like a shared voice, like you guys are splitting up chapters, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So like it's like a 3-part book where the part 1 is like intro stuff, kind of overall like general philosophy, and that's the stuff, Doug is just always had such a brilliant big picture view of that stuff. So Doug wrote the first couple chapters of that. I wrote the second couple chapters. The second part's more like lower body type, return to sport things, where Doug wrote one of the I think Doug and I co-wrote one chapter. Doug wrote another chapter, and then I wrote some of the agility, change of direction stuff. And the third part of the book is dedicated to more upper body overhead throwing athletes, where Greg wrote, all the baseball stuff. Doug wrote some of the combat sport type upper body chapters. So yeah, it's been cool that obviously we went in business together for a long time. We talk all the time. We think alike, very much alike. So it's written from like the same, the same place with different voices, which is going to be cool to read it. And I always like going and reading their stuff and vice versa. It's just cool to be like, yeah, dude, I agree with that, which obviously we should. We kind of, a hive mind at this point in time, but yeah, it's going to be cool to see what the actual final product looks like.
I think it'll be exciting. Well, I think that's what we'll have to do. We'll have to get all three of you on when it all comes out. Hey, two questions I'd love to ask guests, because I think it's important to highlight, and just like the intention, right? The message trying to bring to the community and the audience, like, right? We were talking a lot about test and playing the sport, but you and I both know, especially in return to play in a post-op, like it's the small wins each day that are going to get the people going forward. Like, it's not like oh man, you just passed this test, great. Like, no, it's like, man, the days in between suck, but you got to find a way to motivate the people. So in your space, having so much experience with post-ops and rehabs and return to sport, right? How would you define a small win?
Yeah, there's so many different types of small wins. Like sometimes it's just the connection with the client, like where I've had cases where, like, first off, it's like connecting with the client, I think, is like the first step in actually being able to help somebody. Because if you don't connect with them and have a relationship with them, like, they won't listen to you, they won't buy in, they won't believe in what the process is, they won't be a part of the journey, it won't be a shared experience together. So I think that's a huge piece of it. There's so many, like you said, throughout day 1 to end stage rehab, like there's so many small wins. Like the first day that they actually get like full active knee extension, with their whatever hyperextension range they have, like that's a small win, but that makes so much of a difference in terms of like the overall outcome that we're going to have kind of within their rehab process. I also, a small one that I always enjoy is that first day that we jump or they leave the ground again. Like that's such a small win for that individual, but took a lot of work to kind of get to that point where we're working on different qualities that allow them to do that safely, like we've been speaking about. But yeah, like there's so many small wins that I think we need to count those and emphasize those to our athletes. Like what you did today was huge. I know it's not where you want to be, it's not where we will be, but like you are setting yourself up for success because of the effort and the work that we're doing today. That's the stuff that's going to allow you to be, all state again when you get back on the field or whatever their goals are.
Dude, perfect. And then to piggyback off that, right? Like even just the big ones, right? Like people are always looking. I like to think, maybe I'm biased because of the community I'm involved with, but I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to live a better, more successful life. Live at high performance. Like we see all these athletes, we see all these people performing. Like we want to live high performance in our everyday life. You yourself, you went through a period of, I would say, high performance training, trying to dunk, and you also have experience of helping people upgrade either lifestyles, upgrade training programs, upgrade rehab programs. So for anyone that's listening, trying to make a small change or upgrade something in their lifestyle to achieve high performance, what advice would you have for them?
So this is one of the tougher questions of the day, I would say. Yeah, I mean, find what works for you. I think there's just too many gurus and too many people just spewing out bullshit of stuff that we all kind of intuitively know, and we're relying on other people and not doing it yourself, like no one's like, we learned this from a business standpoint, like no one's going to do the business for you. No one's going to go out of the way to help you. Like you got to do it yourself. And I think like that's how life is, right? Like whatever you want, you just got to make it happen, and you can do it. Like, we talk about like all the advice of, to optimize your life, here's like 1,000 things you should do in the morning before you like go and actually start working. It's like, who has the time to do any of that stuff? Like who can do a cold plunge and then a hot plunge and then a sauna and then do another cold plunge and then journal for 25 minutes and then do your hour-long meditation, right? It's like, there's just too many things that we look at to be able to optimize our life versus like focusing on what actually works for you, understanding what works for you, being honest with yourself, being honest with the people that you have relationships and the people that you love and the people that got your back, and just like fucking doing the work, man. Like I think it's not that hard sometimes, but like we have to just do the work. We have to put in the effort. We have to just go. Like it's time is finite. Time is short. We gotta, if you have goals and you really want to achieve them, and you really want to achieve them and that important, like you just got to do it.
Mic drop.
Keep it real. That's our other piece of it. Just keep it real, man.
1,000% you guys do it. Absolutely, you do too. So hey, man, this was great catching up. We definitely gonna get you guys back on here when the book comes out. When are you guys expecting the book to come out?
The goal is gonna be end of this year or beginning of 2025. So
okay, perfect. So we got
hopefully in the next 8 months. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and then in the interim, like you guys do a great job on your socials promoting a lot of some of the practical stuff that you guys are doing with athletes. So make sure the audience goes and checks out Resilience Performance. What's the social handles?
Resilient PPT, Resilient Performance PT is what the handle stands for.
Awesome.
So that's our Instagram and Twitter or X, whatever it is now.
Well, make sure you check them out, and then be on the lookout for that book coming out at the end of the year. And we certainly will bring the three amigos back on and have a proper angry lunch while we're having a podcast episode. So, dude, good to see you. Good to catch up. I'm happy you were open to this and you provided so much knowledge to the group. So, just thanks, man. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and this was awesome. Appreciate it, man. Good seeing you again.